Welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. This is a podcast about comics where comics and politics meet. And this is your host, Ilana Levin, aka Twitter's Ilana Brooklyn. Joining me is one of my favorite comic writers currently working. It is Kieran Gillen. He first came to attention as a comic creator in 2006 Phonogram with Jamie McKelvey. You guys probably know it's like one of my absolute favorite comics. Jamie and he formed a Gestalt monster, which rampaged against the next 15 years of comics, culminating with the critical and smash hit Wicked plus the Divine, which is everybody's favorite comic. When not with Jamie, he has co-created such books as Die, The Ludocrats, Once and Future, 3, Uber, and many more. When not making his own worlds, he has worked on Marvel Comics' biggest books, such as Uncanny X-Men, Young Avengers, Thor, Iron Man, Star Wars, Eternals, and Darth Vader, where he co-created Dr. Aphra. His hobbies include pop culture, talking about pop culture, redefining what pop culture means in any given context, and putting off updating his bio as long as possible. Welcome back, Kieran.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you about some new work you've had, as well as some stuff that's been out for a while, but that we just never had a chance to talk about. So I want to kick off by talking about the Eternals. It's funny, like when the Eternals movie was announced, it got one of those responses from the public where the comics press was sort of saying like, well, nobody cares about the Eternals, so at least we won't have to complain about people changing it or like stuff from fans. And I'm like, look, fans who complain, or so-called fans who complain about people making things more diverse should fuck off, but don't say that no one cares about the Eternals. It's like a Jack Kirby thing. So I was curious, like, what was your alignment or interest in the series before getting started on it?
Eternals was not actually something I'd read in depth before doing it, as in like that was all part of my research, as in it's one of the books which I mainly understood through reflected on its impacts in the Marvel universe. This is one of the things I got from the Eternals, as in how many really important riffs to the larger Marvel cosmology is in there. You know what I mean? Like the Celestials are such a power chord of a visual. I mean, it's like if I look at my own thing, I think my own first exposure to any of the Eternals cosmology would have been like Infinity Gauntlet. I think when I was reading that, and I was in that area, I wasn't really reading many comics, but the kind of like who on earth are those people at the back? And then you sort of like know through characters like Cersei. I mean, Cersei's somebody I've always particularly liked, but Eternals is very much like one I was like, I don't know that much about the Eternals. Like I'd read the Gaiman Romita Jr. mini when it came out. So, like, I knew that much. But it's like a Kirby work I only know for the visuals rather than the specifics execution. And in some ways, I think my actual idea of what the Eternals were was very much born about people's general conversational idea about the Eternals. You know what I mean? Like, you know, general geek-accepted wisdom, which is always a dangerous thing to look at unquestioned. So at least part of the reason why I did it was to dig into it. As in, like, Kirby's a creator I have an enormous respect for. And having a chance to do a deep dive into the work and see really what he was doing with it, and seeing, you know, how I can, it's very tricky to find the right word, how I can actually do something which I feel like extends from the core of what Kirby was doing then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously like a hardcore Kirby person, and this totally worked for me. I'm not a big fan of all of the appearances that the Eternals have made under the direction of others, and I am really excited to see this because, well, I mean, obviously, like, I read whatever you're doing, but, like, pretty much. But, like, it was also that I felt like I hadn't seen work that was as closely tied to Kirby coming from you yet, and I was curious as to what it would be. Although you've had Celestials and things that you've made before, like, I think some of your stuff on X-Men.
Yeah. It's so telling. I mean, like, I feel quite bad what I did to the Dreaming Celestial. Isn't it kind of like, this was in one of my pitches, sort of often my Eternal documents, I noted like after the Gaiman Romita Jr. mini with the Dreaming Celestial, basically the X-Men office broke the Dreaming Celestial apart for parts, basically as if it was a stolen car, you know, literally across the entire noughties. We ripped that thing completely bare. So there is a bit that. So as I said earlier, so you know, there's so much about the charge, as in that it feels like one of those very pure Marvel Universe comics. And for me, it was like one of the ironies that they never quite had been integrated in a way which stuck to the Marvel Universe. Yep. And that was to me the primary job of it. You know, I was like, okay, what on earth makes the Eternal special for an idea that I mean, obviously, it's very easy to know what makes the Eternals special as their own thing. But when the second you add it to the Marvel Universe, it changes. You know, the core mythology of the Eternals is they are basically born of the 1970s sort of ideas that gods were aliens. These are alien created beings who were mistaken by early humanity as gods. So that's the story. Except that doesn't quite stick as well in the Marvel Universe when you actually have gods like Hercules and Thor and whoever. You know what I mean? It fundamentally dilutes them. And lots of writers have tried to sort of, force it into the square hole. And that, some of the stories are based on Eternals and some of them aren't. And there's some kind of mistaken identity. But it lacks that pure vision. And also, like, this intellectually, it doesn't always... Like, the Eternals... Like, they're this pure burst of Kirby. And there's not really, like, a classical Marvel Universe stuff. Like, the idea that there's like, heroes always like feet of clay. There's not much feet of clay in the Eternals. I mean, one of the things I really do like about Kirby is he creates this idea of, these three species, but really two. And these ones are the good ones, these were the bad ones. And then the second he does that, he immediately realizes, this is nonsense, I've got to start deconstructing this. So you get the heroic Eternals, you get like the Eternals like Karak, who's a name I can never pronounce, and the Reject. The idea of appearance and reality. So he's automatically deconstructing what these ideas mean anyway. So that's sort of the way I end up sort of following. I mean, like some of what I'm doing about the Eternals is even obvious in this first issue, as in I'm leaning into the weirdness of them. I'm leaning into they're unchanging, and that's a bit creepy. And they're, and I've said in many interviews, I thought they're not really gods, they're angels, because, they're eternal beings created by, space gods. So Celestials are the gods in this metaphor. The Eternals are beings created by gods for a task. Oh, they're angels, especially because you dig more into angel doctrine, you get into ideas like maybe angels don't have free will. And that's interesting and creepy. As somebody, I tend to lean existentialist in my own philosophy. So the idea of creating a being who is curtailed in such a fundamental way is really interesting, because that's one of the other themes in a lot of my work is like, what is the capacity for humanity to change, like, or especially for people to change? Can we get better? And the fear that we can't. I guess so. It's like that hope and fear aspect is always very key for me. The Eternals.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, and even from your first handling of the Eternals, when you're mentioning like X-Men stripping the dreaming Celestial for spare parts is one, like the most human response to something like that, and also works on a metaphorical level, right?
It really does, doesn't it? I mean, it's one of the things about the Celestials is this that I put in the notes is the Celestials have got too big for the Eternals. So it's a bit like, I don't know, imagine if Dr. Octopus got took away from Spider-Man. Like the Celestials are so part of so many different Marvel cosmic stories. They're not really just the Eternals. Antagonist is not the right word, but they're not just part of the Eternals cast. It's just where they're from. They're like the Diana Ross to the Supremes of the Eternals in terms of the Marvel Universe.
Oh my god.
That's the most me metaphor I think in a long time.
Yes. That gets an award.
Yeah. But as such, of course, means that like I can't lean on the Celestials because they have the possibility of being taken out of my hands, you know what I mean? Or like they're not as fundamentally connected to the Eternals despite being their creators. So a lot of my stuff is, okay, I want to give Eternals stuff which is theirs and theirs alone, stuff that, it's harder to strip for parts because it's new, or at least it's new as in born. I mean, the main obviously the deviants. So I kind of like, the line I use is like imagine a species of Buffy the Vampire Slayers dealing with this gremlin species who occasionally spits out monsters. I mean, I've sort of moved the deviants away from being these purely monstrous creatures, because let's be honest, Kirby didn't write them like that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. He wrote this and it's like, if these people are monsters, then you immediately meet them and they're not. There's clearly some violent people there, but it's like, if you look at like any sort of country on Earth, it's not like the Mongol hordes have always, the Mongol horde conquered the world for 6,000 years. They've been different. The Mongol people have been very different things at different times. And that's not the best metaphor, but you know what I mean. It's the idea that deviants have only ever been one thing, and they are always that. That is completely against, especially what I think is built into the deviants, that they are the changing people. And the idea of what the deviants are, the absolute opposite of the Eternals, and it gets really interesting, the order chaos dynamic. So I sort of pushed like on average, deviants are just kind of normalish. They're like people, they're a bit needy, whatever, and then they deviant. they deviate, and that's kind of the idea I use of excess deviation is the way the Eternals would put it. As in, when they start, it's the classic. Their freedom reaches the point where they start stepping on other people's feet by often, eating them.
Yes. I think this is my favorite take of the deviants, like since the original material. Oh, their species periodically has individuals who are a little crazy and violent. Quote, a deviant would likely mention to you that you spit out serial killers. Like, thank you.
Yes, that's absolutely one of those kind of, this is stuff I want to make clear, because it's the stuff which I think if it's unexamined in the Eternals becomes problematic very rapidly. And as I said earlier, so I think, Kirby realised that instantly and immediately starts doing it. And I very much want to continue that. The thing about it's also flip as well. I was very into the idea of the Eternals. This is obviously there with Polaris and Olympia. But I was very into the idea of the factionalisation of Eternals. The idea that the Eternals aren't like Krakoa or something like that. They're not like one people. They are very much a society. And in some way, and a society which does not agree with it themselves any more than any society does. And in many ways, Eternals are quite often their own antagonists. If you look at their history, like in terms of, if you look at that, the history of like how it goes back in the Marvel universe, and even in the Kirby work, they're most of the major Eternal struggles have been against other Eternals. You've got the what I call the Uranian heresy. What we have is the Titanos schism. I've sort of renamed some stuff. I've given conflicts names. One of the things I've sort of realised recently is part of Eternals is about me trying to turn continuity into mythology. And the idea of like all these work by all these people. I'm going to sit back, look at it, see the shapes, and okay, how can I turn to something that feels as coherent as Tolkien? The idea that, let's make, Uranos is our Morgoth figure. We can follow the people of the Eternals across a million years and make that feel like a myth. So even people because I think people buy continuity it's not like people who really love the continuity. I hope they'll be satisfied with what we're doing, because it's very clear that I'm thinking about what's there. At the same time, people who don't know continuity are quite intimidated, but people love mythology. The idea that there's more to this universe than that's on the page, that there's more stuff to discover, to be revealed and explored, whilst still being accessible with what we're doing. That's something I think is really appealing for me as a reader. So that's what I was trying to bring to the page on Eternals.
Yeah, I definitely think this comic is something that people who haven't read anything with the Eternals in it before could read and understand. I think, if people don't even read Marvel, I'm not sure if I can assess the accessibility, but I can tell that people who don't know the Eternals, like, you introduce this very well and clearly. As much as I do suggest people check the Kirby, like, it is not required.
No, I agree. I would, people ask me, did anything to read beforehand? And I say, no, it's a number one.
Yeah.
Just, jump in. That's the point of a number one. But like, if you're going to read anything, read the Kirby and read the Gaiman. They're the two, things I think influence the book most. But like, as I said, I'm taking from a lot of other places as well. And plus, I think the longer the run goes on, the more likely I'll take from everyone.
Well, one of the things that I don't know for sure if this is happening, but fingers crossed, is this is something that occurred to me only as I began reading this issue. Your number one issue of the Eternals was, oh my God, I really want to read Kieran writing Crow. Like, that's a thing I need.
Crow's a lot of fun. He's he's not in the first arc, but he's on the list of people who are important. This is one of the things about Eternals is I'm not rushing, because there's so many. This is kind of like, I must admit, this is in some ways the trap Kirby fell into, in that Eternals in the 17 issues plus a special. Is that right?
19 issues.
Right, cool, close.
Yes,
as in he's still introducing new characters all the way through it. There's no end to these Eternals, and he embraces that. And in some ways, I'm like, okay, whilst I'm trying to tell a quite contained story in this larger element, I clearly have a lot of other Eternals, and I'm not just going to cram someone in for no point. And equally, if they're a major character, I want to give them a good intro. It's like when Crow turns up, I want people to go, "It's Crow," or like, rather than just him wandering in the back of the scene, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And for those of you who have no idea who the fuck Crow is, he's one of the deviants who is very intellectual and very sardonic. And at least like these are the qualities that maybe be like, I want. And he's an antagonist who's like not evil. He's just like comes as a person who comes into conflict sometimes with the Celestials, but is certainly he's very compelling, and his particular sense of dry humor is something I want Kieran writing. So
yeah, it's fun. Like it's also he's in a perpetual on-off relationship with Thena, which is the classic Romeo and Juliet of the Eternals.
Yeah.
So he's mentioned it. I must say he's mentioned in the first arc. I will definitely say that.
Well, I'm fine with waiting, but yeah, I'm excited that we'll be getting there. You've done some really cool work, working with the characters that we've seen so far. I like the idea of bringing Sprite back as a girl, for example, and a good, very natural introduction of how a character might change gender over time.
Thank you. It's definitely that kind of it's one. Obviously, this is in line with what the characters' genders in the movie, and it's one of those things where I just couldn't see a good reason not to. You know what I mean? These are, especially because I'm leaning that the Eternals aren't people, and this is one of the things that rather the Eternals aren't humans. We can pick apart the meaning of the word people if we want, but they are explicitly something unlike us. So it allows us to sort of approach different ideas of identity, and the Eternals were never ever like a human male or female or any racial. They just they only ever had the appearance because they weren't born of the humanic species in that way, I guess. So that's what I want. I couldn't see any reason to alienate newcomers, and equally, it just seems such a cool science fiction bit of the Eternals. And I think if it wasn't a movie, would I have done that stuff? And part of me thinks, yeah, probably. Because that kind of the idea that the Eternals are playing or or taking these different things on in different periods. That is quite an interesting idea in and of itself. Oh, before we moved on from the Deviants, there's something I wanted to mention. The issue 3 is the Deviant issue where we sort of introduce what's going on in Lemuria. One of the things I've done there is I've written a Deviant name generator. I've actually coded it. So I took all the in Canon Deviant names and broke them into phenomes and added some subtitles and other ways to do it. And you just press the button, it generates 1,000 Deviant names. And I need to tweak it a bit more before we get issue 3 goes to press, but I want to make it big enough that we can get, and also it never generates a repeated name or stuff like that. So I want to almost generate the entire number of deviants on Earth and give them all a name. It's that kind of, that says a lot about the way that I'm approaching Eternals. There's this sort of elements that I got a bit, which I've kind of grown from doing Die, as in I believe that I try to want to put extra, so I would say, a little bit weird efforts above and beyond what's on the page. Just to kind of it's quite, because you can say what you like about Tolkien, because, I'm not necessarily the biggest, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, but I certainly have huge problems with the work. But there's a solidity. You engage with the text critically, like you're supposed to. Yeah. I think I've got one of my friends, she's a big Tolkien scholar, and her take of the reason why he can never quite finish the Silmarillion is he had recognised the problem of orcs. And, in this, there's no way, oops, there's problems here. But what we're saying is, in terms of an intellectual achievement, there's a weight to Middle Earth that is simply not as true in many other fantasy worlds, because he'd done the work. You know what I mean? And this is what I kind of try to do with Die, and what I'm trying to do with Eternals is the idea that there is a lot of work around here. And that makes people kind of the fantasy world has a solidity and weight, which is quite appealing, and has its own kind of merits. And this is me pushing back against, because I think in the last 20 years, there's been the accepted wisdom in writing is world building is not an end, it's something to be avoided. And there's, world building something that gets in the way. And I'm sort of playing with the, maybe world building's okay. Maybe, it's a problem when it gets in the way and it becomes just stuff on the page. But maybe world building actually does something to the actual solidity of the work. And it feels like me, I don't know, it's like a punk kid, me finally trying out Led Zeppelin. You know what I mean? As in, I haven't allowed myself to listen to Led Zeppelin.
Yeah. I especially in context of Eternals, that makes a lot of sense too. I'm really loving it. And it also kind of makes for it's cool to have this coming out at the same time as the Krakoa era of X-Men. Because there are things that are happening here that are basically offering a completely different take on some of the ideas and notions that are brought there. And it stands on its own, obviously, but I love looking at those differences. You're saying there's different cultures within the Eternals in conflict right now, and their relationship to humanity is obviously completely different.
It's interesting. It's like there's so many elements of Krakoa which are quote unquote similar to the Eternals. You know, at the same time, Krakoa is the new society, which is the entire point. It's a book about like how can we make a mutant. You know, how can we make a nation from scratch? The problem of doing that. Whilst Eternals is very much a mature society. It's a stagnant society. And that's kind of that's implicit in the nature of the word eternal. And it's pure, it's like, part of me, I look at my thinking about Eternals, it's about my own fears for like liberal democracy. I don't mean in a cool revolutionary way. I mean in a kind of it burning down way. You know what I mean? As in like, oh yeah, like this is, as in how could our, you know, how much is a kind of system change after a certain point? And like, how much does the ethics of a system, you know what I mean? All those sort of questions. And it's kind of, with the Eternals, you can sort of turn up the volume a lot. Like, I said, how unjust is the Eternal system? And can they do anything about it? And that seems like a really, like I said, sorry, to return to your actual question, it's like, it is literally the flip of Krakoa in terms of like, that's about making something new. And this is like, you know, you've got something that's very, very old. What can you do with that?
Yeah, I love that focus. It's really great. I also think like there's also something from the initial creation idea of the Eternals that I think was very culturally specific at the time it was created, and that is now a notion that we are like have a more complex relationship to, which was, you know, this is partially inspired by Chariots of the Chariots of the Gods ideas, where like, oh, okay, you know, what if the pyramids are actually made by aliens? What if the ziggurats are made by aliens? Which, you know, at first as a reader, you're like, oh, that's a cool idea. And then a second later, you're like, wait, are we saying that these great works made by people of color couldn't possibly be made by people of color and must be made by aliens? That sounds problematic. So I'm definitely interested in like, you know, I'm definitely interested in like, you know, thinking about how you have specific, and you've mapped them this way, exactly, you know, how the earlier works has been, which is like you have the part of the Eternals society is like based out of Mesoamerica and Central America. And like when you first are looking at the initial designs around like characters, you know, who are coming out right then, like Ajak, you're like, okay, this guy was clearly carved into a wall by Mayans. Like that's where this design comes from. I love that Kirby is bringing these looks and styles into the comic. But then it's also like, yeah, but like, what are we giving credit to aliens that's like actually work by humans?
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely echo my thoughts, and it's definitely one of the many tricky things you have to unpack with a book, I guess, and work out ways to do it. And like, I mean, and you have to sort of see by the ways I step away from stuff. It's like, you may even like where I've put you know, we've been to Olympia, we've been to the Exclusion, we've been to Titanos, but you know, I put them in pocket dimensions. You know, I explicitly separate them. I don't imply they're building anything on the surface. I'm talking about lack of interaction with the outer world. There's a, you know, or there's a lack of, has that been talked about properly yet? So I'm just trying to think if that's a spoiler. There's definitely, oh, that comes soon enough. But you know, there is a kind of idea of the Eternals as in, no, they're not meant to rule the Earth. You know, that's a kind of that's, if they did, you know, that's, if they don't think the Deviants should do it, they don't think they should do it either. And you may notice the one thing that isn't in the list of prime directives for Eternals on the first page is protect humans. It's protect the machine, and it's this is one of my favourite things Eternals is just people getting into philosophical arguments over what protect the machine means, because it's this is source. Okay, I could talk about this. Why not? It's like that's the Uranus heresy. That's the original Morgothian Satan element. In that, yeah, we should just wipe out everyone else on the planet and rule it. You know, the safest way to rule the machine if its only thing is Eternals and no deviants and no proto-humans and none of that. And that's such a dangerous idea. That's the reason why he's in the Exclusion forever. And then you've got I've got someone like a Druid who's, talk about character I love writing. He is awful. He's so awful, but there's something really appealing about him in that awful way. I mean, I use the phrase soft Uranites. You know, people with Uranite beliefs, but they're kind of like, they're deliberately hiding them a little. And you can sort of, you can easily map that onto like modern politics. That's at least kind of what I was want to do with Eternals, and the idea of like, okay, what did Kronos really believe? Let's try to make that an actual philosophy, at least that's defensible. Like, there's a bit in one of the future issues where I'm going to have a flow chart of arguments people made in a political debate. Like, as in, like this, they said it's like basically like Eternals. Okay, I'm going to say this, and somebody on Twitter will take this seriously. It's like Eternals Twitter, but what I just mean is like, that kind of those arguments. People, they say this, then they say this, and it kind of. This is one reason I don't go on Twitter as much, but it's like watching people going through martial arts stances. As in like, yes, I can see this attack, and this is countered by this, which is countered by this. In that chain. And I'd be doing an Eternal version of that kind of philosophical argument is a lot, that's a lot of fun.
That's my idea of a good time. So I'm really excited when that happens. And I'm interested like in how you're using sort of data pages type structures in this, which is, you've been doing this in your work for a long time. This is not like a new thing. Like you've always had a sort of metatextual combination of outside documents and written kinds of communications, like even as far back as phonogram. So I like how that got used in the Eternals also for sort of an interesting sort of storytelling effect.
Thank you. I mean, I just saw on Graphics Policy, the Phonogram Singles Club issue 6, which is the fanzine issue, an article just went live today. Which is a really good, an early example of me doing that. It's quite fun because obviously, like everyone says, it's post-Hickman, and without a doubt, this is one of the connective tissues between John and my work. And I think I would have done more of it if I was a designer. John's great strength, as he's always done a lot of it, is that he's also an amazing designer, so he can just do it himself. Also,
and your strength is you can fanzine it.
Yeah, exactly. I only ever do it like, I've got to approach all these things in slightly different ways because I haven't got his ability to just do it. But I'm definitely like that. John had done it with all the X books, opened up a space that, right, I could talk Marvel into giving a budget for this now.
Right. And
that's the exciting thing. So I can use this for like get the world building and also try to find slightly different purposes than that's the joy of actually seeing like what the X office has done with it and what I'm trying to do, and other, I'm also doing with Warhammer books in a different way. That what can you do with the text page, and it's like that list of names at the start is very different. At least in my head, its purpose is like a map at the top. It's like a map at the front of Lord of the Rings. The point is not to sit there and read it all. The point is to go, oh, I wonder what that means, or what's this place, or also maps are for reference. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it's, and for me, that beat was about, here is all these characters. Maybe you'll get to know some of them. But that is also here and it's solid and big and real. So, I'm really enjoying getting a chance to do that. And I must admit, I've got quite a few ideas of stuff I want to do, like both in Eternals and maybe in books down the line. Yeah, it's fun because for me, I was always like, comics are about juxtaposition of image and, image, and that includes words, because words are also pictorial information. So I've always had a sort of more design element to my comic storytelling. The idea that it's not just glorified storyboards. It's the idea that, we can throw these stuff around and create an aesthetic effect. You mentioned Singles Club. I remember thinking about those covers, and I was looking at them recently. And then some of those Single Clubs covers have more words than many comics on. But it's using words, and I reread them. It's like, oh my God, that was in... It's long ago now that it seems a very different me, obviously. But
sure.
There's a kind of delight to seeing a younger you doing it and really going for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, then the idea that you can look at it and it looks cool because it's a flyer, and and that's what flyers are like. But if you really absorb it, there's more stuff there for you. And there's, it's that kind of, it will give back to you. Yeah.
And also, it's worth revisiting. Like, shout out to Logan Dalton for doing this phonogram deep dive series. I've written about the most recent, the phonogram part 3. I cover, and I'd love folks to go read it if you haven't read it yet. But I've never gone back and done Singles Club. And what I enjoy with reading Logan's Singles Club stuff is not just that he's a really good critic, but also he is significantly younger than you or I. So it really is a testament to how this works for folks who aren't of our generation,
No, I agree. It's like, and it's some of the things. I mean, I just saw Ram V's new book is using. I mean, Ram's not usually younger than we are. Like Ram's like 30s, but
okay.
It's like, but he didn't grow up in Britpop,
right?
So that kind of like, when at the time people always ask, "Oh, it will date or it's too limited. And I always answered no, because I don't care. Because
Right.
I believe speaking a specific truth is worthwhile. But also,
Sorry, whose book is this? You're saying Ram?
Ram V has got a new book out. He's actually doing it's just been out. I think it's Vault. I forgot the artist. I think it's the his blue and green artist, whose name I forgot, unfortunately. And its alt cover is a Phonogram Rue Britannia homage cover.
Oh shit! I'm gonna check this out. I was not aware.
Ram told me about it, I think, back when we could still meet in the pubs. And it sounds really exciting. But point being, Phonogram, now that it is an established work that exists that people come to later, it kind of proves what me and Jamie always hoped, was that, yes, we're using a very specific example and we're talking about a very specific scene, but like, this is how people can read into it what they will. They can see how this is similar to their lives and how it's different to their lives. And that's kind of the hope. And part of Phonogram was always that your very specific experience is interesting. And I use mine because it was, just because it was mine. But I wanted to hear other people's. The kind of the sadness of Phonogram was, one of the many sadnesses of Phonogram. We always wanted to do like an anthology, like of other people's Phonogram stories, not about our characters, but about turn your own experiences about music into magic. Tell me about the scene you grew up in. Tell me about like listening to, records, like as a toddler or whatever. I mean, I always say like the thing that my dad, when he died, he left me a mixtape with some notes he'd written about each song. And it was made, honestly, and that, of course, came from my mum and dad did mention how me doing Phonogram has made them think about music in a different way as well. But that whole anecdote of like listening to a mixtape that your dad left you as I was a 38-year-old man then, that is a pure Phonogram story. And that was kind of the sort of shame that the metaphor is much wider than what we got to do with it. And the fact that people are still finding Phonogram and getting stuff from it, despite being much younger and no way connected to any of the scenes that I was involved in, kind of speaks to what I hope the book was about.
It's not too late for that to happen, is it?
I think me and Jamie I think me and Jamie more like to do new stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's always that, I think, as in we don't really want to repeat ourselves.
Sure. No, I understood.
It's just like I always take the level of momentum to do that, because there's always new stuff you want to do as well.
Yes. Speaking of new stuff, the new stuff that isn't as new anymore, but that we've never had a chance to talk about till now, I realize is we've never covered Thunderbolt on the podcast, Peter Cannon Thunderbolt on the podcast, or Once and Future really in any significant way. And Thunderbolt has really become a thing. I'm really excited. It feels like a lot of people have. One of the most exciting things for me about Thunderbolt isn't just that, like, here's a really good comic that I really like. It's also that you've made critics talk about the act of criticism in ways that have been reflective and useful for us.
Thank you. Honestly, I'm incredibly proud of that book. I mean, it sold terribly, I believe, but I think it feels like that it found an audience. The audience it did find, and the audience it's found afterwards are like really smart, very much engaged. In fact, some ways I think about Peter Cannon Thunderbolt is me doing for superhero comics and comics generally what my work often does for other forms of media. I rarely, in fact, until Peter Cannon, I've never done a comic about comics in that way. Because comics against comics is something that bugged me a lot when I was coming in. I was like, why can't comics be about other things? So I did, these comics about, even people, if you just, ideally comics should be, comics can be about anything. But, why, and it always frustrated me about, like, say, people's reading of Grant Morrison's work always brought it back down to it being about comics, whilst failing to understand it was also talking about capitalism and consumerism and all these kind of larger things. It's like, if you think it's just comics, it's, it's a limitation of what the work is actually doing. So in some ways, like it was incredibly good seeing that me bringing the skill set that I apply in Phonogram or Die or whatever to comics and a certain kind of comics. Obviously, it's going to appeal to a certain kind of critic because it's absolutely a piece of criticism. And so I've got lost I've got around in a circle then. I don't mean to sound angry there either. Yeah, it's nice. It was genuinely nice to say that, that like applying the Phonogram skill set to a superhero comic, and at the same time trying to do something with a human heart to it. I think that's kind of some of the writing around I'm most touched by is people have analysed, just the basic humanity of the character. Peter Cannon is somebody who is archetypal and brittle. But at the same time, it's like an archetypal, brittle person who wanted to be shall we say, a better human, or trying to be human full stop. That's the story. And I've definitely seen some analysis of Peter Cannon, like, in a very real way. I'm a queer guy in my early 40s, actually mid 40s now, but I was, early 40s when I think I wrote it. And I'm very much aggressively wanting to question my assumptions. And also a guy who's burnt out in superhero comics. Like I'd left the Marvel Universe, because I was just burnt out on working there. Not in a bad way, but in just a kind of, my attention works like this. And Peter Cannon was me saying, okay, are you feeling refreshed enough to maybe do it again? And in some ways, me doing Eternals has been about proving yes. So me doing Peter Cannon was like, yes, I actually do like this genre. It allows me to do certain things I couldn't do elsewhere. And then sort of go forward into it. Yeah. Does that answer the question? I don't know.
Yes, definitely. But also I was going to say, speaking of that, we know, those of us who've really followed, when you've spoken about your own work, it's we know how important getting into Watchmen was to getting you into comics, period. And what's always interesting to me for people for whom Watchmen is sort of the gateway is, well, yes, but when did you get into superheroes? Do you know what I mean? And so I actually feel like, I don't know if I've ever asked you, when did you actually get interested in DC and Marvel's superheroes?
Well, it's tricky. And as a proper kid, as in a preteen, I read the British reprints,
Right.
American comics were really difficult to get hold of in the UK. It was you could never be sure if they're going to be on the shelves. So I read a handful of American comics entirely out of context, which is a great joy.
Yeah.
I think it's Uncanny X-Men 208. And they're in San Francisco, they're fighting Freedom Force. There's a bit where I finally went back and read it. The bit where Rogue's really badly hurt and Spiral has dragged her into Mojoverse, I think, at the end. And this really good fight against Nimrod. That was a really good issue. But I had no idea what happened after or before that for 30 years. And it's really good. Anyway, so I sort of fell out of reading comics as a teenager, just because they weren't really available properly. And that's my usual story. And I got back into Watchmen when I was 21. The more true story is one of my best mates, David, he was still buying Marvel superhero comics. My brother was buying 2000 AD. So, I quite regularly read bits of him. There's that kind of oh, this is interesting. And I'm somebody who quite likes superheroes. I'm not somebody who would define it as the major genre I like, but I quite like, there's something that absolutely is there in the preteen state. And this is one of the things that led to when I started writing and getting into comics as an adult was I find the Marvel universe much easier to understand than the DC universe because I've got that very basic grounding, having read a bunch of kids. Even if I didn't know how it tied together, I know the shapes. I know the Celestials are these weird space gods. I know Spider-Man lives in New York. I know I know the Daily Bugle. All that kind of stuff. And I simply don't have that for DC. I've certainly got some of it now, but that kind of basic understanding of what character is important. Or not obviously the A-list, most of the B-list, but I was when I was researching this Riddler story I'm doing for DC. This little 8-page
Yes,
thing.
I wanted to ask about that. That's blew my mind. Oh my god!
It blew my mind. Trust me, it's that incredibly hard work that 8 pages was. I think it took me almost a month to write, and I remember writing the editor Andy Curry at the time. It's this writing this script has definitely become uneconomical about 2 weeks ago. But it's people don't like the Riddler, or DC fans tend to think the Riddler is very much not a serious character worth thinking about. And I was like, what? How can that be true?
Right.
So those that kind of that's a good way of putting it. I said that I knew what the Eternals were in a very basic way by their fan reputation. I don't know the DC universe in the same way.
But you're totally the guy who's going to write a take on the Riddler that's going to, I think, make people who've never been into him suddenly interested. That's a great fit,
Honestly, this is a very weird, formless, playful, silly. Silly is a loaded word, but it's very silly. But it's also ridiculously existentialist kind of thing. And it's a big burst of me and Jamie. And it's if I was ever doing an ongoing comic at DC, it would have a very different vibe. But it's very much I'm not even sure people understand this 8-page comic because I think it's simultaneously very accessible, but its actual point is quite hard to get. But this point is hard enough to get and obvious enough that people realise they're missing something. And at least part of the thinking that went into this story is the Riddler should be hard to figure out. That's the point of the Riddler, you know? And Batman's a genius to be able to deal with him. You know?
Yeah.
So we'll see what people make of it. It'll be very pretty. Jamie's killed.
Yeah, I just found out that this was even going to be a thing. So I'm excited to hear you see you guys together, and just like was not expecting. So for folks who don't know, like I didn't know until yesterday, it's going to be in Batman Black and White #5. Is that it? And that'll be out. I think so. It'll be out in like the April or something like that. So yes, excited to see that. But yeah, I mean, I also just thought it was interesting that you were telling the story about Watchmen to an extent using another Charlton character. Like there's something now where like if you're going to have a Charlton character, it's like been Watchmenized. It
is interesting. I mean, like that was when I was chatting to Nicky about doing something. He got a list of characters they have they own the rights to, and that's Peter Cannon's in there. And shall we say, I must have less of my open anger about certain projects involving Watchmen is in the comic, as in like it's a much more optimistic and it's talk about the work and the medium generally. But there's definitely like I'm angry about Doomsday Clock. That's
yes.
I don't.
Thank you.
I don't want to go on a tear about anything because it's definitely because I haven't even read it and I won't. But there's I'm very much a Watchmen fundamentalist. So I was so much Watchmen stuff was in my mind anyway. Especially because why do I love it? Why do I think it's interesting? Why do I think it did what it did? And why do I think that love should not be unquestioned? And in which ways Watchmen is a dead end. So when I saw like Peter Cannon was that list, there was a kind of sort of almost like a raised eyebrow between me and Nicky, and I went away and kind of came up with what I did. I mean, I almost called it Peter Cannon, as in Canon, to really live it. But yeah, it thought the idea of like just looking. I mean, and I did the research on Peter. Obviously, there's not many Peter Cannon actual comics, but like I looked at his broader work and the things that was done with him, and like my Peter Cannon is very much embedded in my reading of Pete Morse's work. And it's some interestingly weird stuff in there. Like this bit where literally he summons a dragon out of his imagination, and he never does anything out. Like it's imagine like I don't know, Daredevil suddenly summons like Godzilla for an issue, and then never no one ever mentions it again. It's like what, Pete? What are you on? So at the same time, I was trying to be respectful and look at the work. I wanted to discuss that because the thing about Thunderbolt, for all its intrinsic merits, what's really interesting about it is it's analog, and what does that mean? And what does that mean speaking generally? Because there's the other thing I really like about Peter Cannon Thunderbolt as a character is the estate of Pete Morse owns it. It's the great, and when you compare that to what happened to Alan, compared to Alan Moore and his relationship with DC, that Ozymandias, of course, is more powerful in pop culture in every single way, but its creator has no access to it, or one of its creators has nothing to do with it. Whilst even now, when Pete Morse's dead, they still own Thunderbolt. So in some ways, Thunderbolt's cleverer than Ozymandias. And I've no idea how Pete Morse managed to get away with still owning it. In this, working in Charlton in the 60s, but he did. And there's something really appealing on a kind of like political level there with that. Yeah, and it was definitely me. And I love them. It's funny. This is the flip. As in, I'm somebody who loves the 9-panel grid, and I rarely ever write it. I'm somebody who's very influenced by Watchmen, but my influence of Watchmen, much like I expressly say in Peter Cannon, is the point of Watchmen is to push the stuff and make something new. The least Watchman-y thing to do is actually do a 9-panel grid, because and there's 100%. Like Wick did, it's all about formalism and trying stuff out and structuralism and rereading it and larger, all that stuff. And there's bits and there's moments we do a tiny bit of Watchmen, and there's moments we make it explicit, but they're very, very rare. And for me, it was always about the doing the new and kind of like stepping back and really kind of digging into what Watchmen did, who ripped him off, what was going on parallel. I think issue 4 is kind of like the real heart of the argument, in that people very much put Watchmen in the tradition of the American deconstructionist superhero comic, which of course is true in lots of ways. But the other argument is Alan Moore is like a hippie from near the Midlands, in England, born of a working class background and born of the scene that Eddie Campbell describes in Alec How to Be an Artist. You know, he's an absolutely underground British cartoonist. And seeing Watchmen as an extrapolation of that rather than part of the American tradition is a completely justified way to look at Watchmen. Like, what in other ways, Watchmen is closer to the Alec books than it is to, I don't know, the Avengers. And that was very much part of the argument as well. I don't know, I think was it Fraction I said this? I think Fraction said to me, but it's like, this is Peter Cannon is absolutely the deep cut in my discography. It's the one the heads will be into. I feel like it's Flex Mentalo. You know, as Flex Mentalo is to Grant, Peter Cannon is to me, I think.
That sounds right. With regards to Once the Future, which I've really just plowed through, I've been enjoying. I like how you are addressing there's this idea that people have that like English culture and history is one thing when it's actually many things, and that pointing out the ways in which something that has maybe been approached as being a hegemony is actually built out of disparate cultures is a really interesting response to nationalism. And I don't know that I've seen another work take that stance of it, frankly.
Thank you. That's interesting. I just the weird thing about What's the Future is I think I had the idea well before. I think I had it in like 2008, maybe 2009. The core idea of how could you do a modern mummy and try to remove the colonialism from it, use King Arthur, and then immediately and of course King Arthur is originally a Welsh character, and therefore he would hate Anglo-Saxon Nazis who would raise him up. You know, that core irony was there from the beginning, and I just put it on the file and kept it there. And of course, it's that when with the rise of nationalism in the last decade, it's only became ever and ever more relevant. So it's very much like when Boom asked me to do a book with Dan, it was like, oh, this might be the one to develop right now. I mean, it's definitely that you could. That's the thing about What's the Future. As timely as it is, you could do this story at any point from now to, I don't know, 400 AD. You know, as in all the way through, it's the question about what does Britain mean anyway? Because I'm going to please any real studies of the concept of British identity. Don't jump on me too hard for this, but you know, Britain, you know, the Britons, you know, mean the Welsh. That's what Britons means, and that all that kind of, you know, as in, you know, when Arthur being king of the Britons means that basically Arthur is king of the Welsh, and all this sort of stuff. And of course, Britain has been lifted from that position and moved into a different position. And what Arthur meant in different periods, and this is where the research was fascinating. It's like, you know, Arthur being seen very much as a radical figure. Still about 1100, 1200, he was seen as like a Welsh nationalist figure and something to be kind of like cracked down upon. And then you get sort of, then you get the French sort of, you get the French romances that changes it, and these different strands. And the idea that Arthur had been created that speaks to the fears and hopes of the time was really appealing, you know? And that's kind of what, that's what What's the Future is. Also, it's both commenting on and it's also doing.
Well, you know, and as Americans, especially through things like the 17, you know, as Americans are like having to re-examine our history in a way that is like, you know, causing and contribute, like people are having actual violent responses to America coming to terms with history. I think I don't want people to think this is like just a British comic. Like the challenges that you're tackling in it are things that other cultures need to engage with also.
No, I definitely think so. I mean, that's kind of once again, we return to Phonogram. We kind of hope that the specifics of this situation are interesting, but also applicable further. And people think, okay, how does my own country's, national history and national myths hold up to this? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things I just saw, I saw something on Twitter. It seems like a lot of young, and by young people, I mean like kids in school today, like they don't believe that Helen Keller was a real person. She sort of exists in their mind like a Paul Bunyan type thing. And like thinking about what happens when you're actually even mythologizing real people for whom we know actually existed. And like, she was a socialist, by the way. and like how things are being mythologized that are like literally actually history.
Yes, very much so. And like the liminal space between the two, and like I mean, you think about like maybe it's less true now, but you talk about like say Catherine the Great. What's the first thing people will say about her? Probably that completely fake story about how she got killed.
Yep.
You know, and that people have been slandering and warping the stories of historical figures for as long as anyone's been writing stuff down.
Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare is like, I'm the first person to be like, I actually don't know anything about British history of that time because I literally only know the Shakespearean propaganda and like other playwrights' propaganda that were from the period. That's it.
I mean, like, this is one of the fun things. Like, you know, King Lear was actually originally a mythological figure, a Brittonic mythological figure about 600 AD.
No.
Like, King Lear's a very old myth. I got this from the Once a Future research. Like, he's a really very, very old myth. And of course, thanks to Shakespeare, we don't know he's a myth anymore. We know all we know is he's a literary figure. And that's fascinating because that's something that rarely happens. And it makes you think about, I mean, Tolkien thought this about Beowulf. Tolkien thought Beowulf was, he wrote his own idea of what a folkloric proto-Beowulf would be like. And that kind of the idea that King Lear has ascended from, not ascended or descended, let's say changed. He's changed from myth to literature due to the one work of art, you know, by some dude from Stratford. And that's fascinating. And that's like, that's almost like I wouldn't say quite the opposite of a historical figure becoming more fictional. But it's certainly an interesting parallel thing.
I don't remember. Were you raised Catholic or Protestant?
I'm Catholic.
I
was raised Catholic.
Right, raised Catholic. Yeah, I was literally having a conversation in the car yesterday with my husband, who was also raised Catholic, about which saints are people and which like were completely mythological, and like how the church has changed its relationship to those notions. Like sometimes it's like, holy crap, you know, like, yeah, St. Francis was actually a real person, and like St. George was, you know, not so much. Like it's determining who are these real figures, and it is crazy that how much we know about certain people who like they didn't do things that's reported, but like they did exist. Like it's how humans have like mushed together mythology and people is from extreme distant past.
Yeah, I must admit, and I always find I'm somebody who's like addicted to research. I'm always twitchy around faking stuff. Like when I'm writing historical figures, I'm like, can I justify writing this? And even like in a book like Uber, and like I had one of the the German Wehrmacht generals commit suicide, and he didn't commit suicide in real life. And I was like, am I ethically allowed? And that's with a fucking Nazi, you know, that's a Nazi person. And I worry about it then. And in the end, I said, yes, it was something that they did a lot. But like, that's one reason why stuff like Die or Wictive, there's always, like in Die, especially you have all these historical figures like, you know, H.G. Wells and the Brontes. But like they explicitly say they're echoes. They're not really the people. They're some kind of fictional ghost of them, essentially, that has an element of truth or not. And that gives me the inch I need to do stuff with them, because because the idea of writing about the kind of the fictional ghosts of people is simultaneously what we're both talking about now, but also gives me the intellectual freedom to have that and do that to them.
Speaking of Die, I think I've said, I had a whole episode of my podcast about how people are playing RPG games now during COVID, because it's a hobby that, as much as it's like way better in person for most of us, it does translate to being a thing that can be done online. And doing it online has expanded the audience of people able to participate in it, as well as the people who are able to play it, as well as like people's interest in learning it in the first place, because it is a hobby that you can do from home. How do you feel like has COVID impacted how Die as an RPG has been played by people and its dissemination?
Well, we've certainly got better playtesting for socially distanced games now, in that way. As in, like, I hadn't before the lockdown, I had not played Die at all myself via distanced and streaming. And afterwards, like I finished the entire Die campaign I've ran. So we went through like 35 sessions, about like maybe 30 of them I think were like distance. And on a personal level, I played a lot of like RPGs have been my main hobby during the last year and a half. Even without lockdown, it would have been, but with lockdown, doubly so. It's put different pressures on different bits of the playtesting. It's one of the interesting things. My gut feeling, I tend to think most narrative games tend to do better socially distanced than a more traditional crunchy game, because the mechanics slow down a lot on Roll20. Whilst since there's less rolls in most narrative games, it means you can play it and worry about it less. I mean, it's taught me to be a better GM on streaming, because it's like, it's stuff like, if you're playing a game, it's like running a Zoom chat. You've got to explicitly say, ask individual people. You don't say, has anyone got any ideas? Because then everyone just shuts up and they try to speak over each other. So you say, hey, Chrissy, what are you doing now? You've got to guide, that's the thing about playing online. You've got to guide it more in terms of who's talking when. And as if you're actually the person facilitating, you've got to be aware of who's spoken of, even more so than an usual game, because you're in control of it more. But it's been interesting, and a lot of people seem to have played it. This is nice. I mean, there's a active Discord of Die. I did another release of rules just before Christmas, like finally getting like a full version of the master in. And people seem to like it, which is nice. It's something I'm quite proud. I'm proud of it in that way, and I'm hoping I'll do a Kickstarter this year. I don't know that for sure. Hopefully, I'll finish the full release of whatever, and we'll work out what to do with it.
I really enjoyed the game that we played. One of the things that I didn't realize I'd be doing until I began playing was, oh, right, you're creating a character and your character creates a character.
Yeah.
And character creation is the most fun part of the game for a lot of us. So you've built an RPG where we get to do the cool thing twice.
It isn't like, it's that kind of, the nesting, the Russian nesting doll of Die is interesting. That kind of, we're going to generate a real world person. Now that real world person is going to make a character. And it's a game that's always about the liminality between why do we play games? So if we're making a person, then why did that person make their choices? And one of the things, like, especially with the campaign, but I think when I run Die, it's a lot about this end as well, is that character generation also never really ends. Like, one of the main things I do in Die is that, this is the problem actually, because if you're playing in a fantasy game, you're in a fantasy world, you're walking around, that world becomes more real than your actual character's life back home. So in other words, in the campaign, that random goblin you became friends with in the first session would be more of a real person than your character's parents, because they have not been in the fantasy world. So one of the ways that I do it, I'm always, that part of the actual, especially the full system, is that you're always asking questions about the real world. You're always asking, so tell me about what your favourite food was. Tell me about the last time you saw your mum. Tell me about, that kind of, and then you fold that back into the fantasy world. But that kind of like, there's a whole chapter called basically character generation never ends. And that's kind of one of the cool things in Die, and that, because it's especially like people are interesting. And,
I love it.
And dungeons are always metaphorical, because dungeons are always what's inside people. You're going into the primal cave. I mean, D&D traditionally treats dungeons like the Death Star on Star Wars, as in you go in there and you get stuff and you blow it up. Whilst Die, what definitely something I'm trying to do is treating dungeons like you treat the cave on Dagobah in Empire. The idea, this is definitely a place you go to and you face a peril and you face something, but you're probably the bad guy. This is really about your own emotional messiness. But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope you get to play it again.
Yeah, I have to get on the Discord. I would be curious to see how folks are talking about their games right now. But yeah, like just from a strict mechanics standpoint, I think building it that way is amazing. And I haven't, the idea of reminding people to keep coming up with these aspects of their real world character is a cool one for keeping us engaged through that.
There's a really minor rule I threw in the campaign, which I haven't actually put in the public rules yet, but it's, I just want to basically encourage people to do flashbacks to reality. And it's as basic as describe a flashback to an event in the real world that is relevant to what's about to happen, and you get an advantage on whatever happens. So you basically get, it's equivalent to getting +1 to hit if you tell me something like, imagine, the basic example would be a time you were in an argument, you face down a bully at school, and then you're facing down a monster in the world of Die, and you get +1 to hit, or the equivalent to that. But the idea of actually slightly softly mechanising and encouraging players to do it, and once you've started like doing it just to get that +1, they start doing it as part of their tool set.
Yeah,
like that's definitely kind of what I would like to work out ways to do more of without turning into just you don't want to make it just people like flashing back. You want people. The point is to encourage. It's a reward for people doing it rather than just something that's meant to be power gamed.
Yeah, anything that moves things from just being about beating people with an axe to like storytelling and character is like part of like that's what I'm interested in. And you're just giving a DM an incentive to make the game be more like how I want it to be. So hooray! I think that's fabulous. And like when I'm playing D&D, like the less often we have to roll and the more often things are character driven, or any other game really, like the better I'm feeling about it. I'm playing right now. There's a new RPG that one of my friends did the art for, created, called Stillfleet, which they describe as being tax punk, but that's another story. And in order to incentivize, characters making character choices that aren't just based on what will help us win, but are also based on like the way the character thinks, is they've built in an incentive for your character to act like their most self possible, rather than just like the most strategic thing they could choose to do.
That's nice. There's always like I've got various designs I play around with, and I suspect that if depending how tired I am when I get off this and my various other work, there's like a 1-page RPG I want to write, because I've got an itch.io page now, so where my indie RPGs are. I did an RPG based around the British TV show Come Dine With Me, which is about a competitive dinner party show. Which, like that was our lockdown was, but we watched like hundreds of episodes of this for like the first half of lockdown, like 6-7 months. We watched so many, and I sat there and I eventually mechanized it in my head. I said, "This is the structure," and I wrote the game and it plays. It's actually very funny. It's like it's just a comedy game, and you basically have to you generate the people doing the competitive dinner parties, and then. I'm sorry, there's a video of me playing it with like Chrissy and Al Ewing and various people like that. Lob that in the show notes, because it's genuinely quite a delight to watch, because it's so dumb. But there's a game design. I'm thinking it's really short. I should try to write it up. But my idea is, one thing I've been doing this year is socially distanced walks, and by which I mean not with anyone. Like I put on my headphones and I call a friend, and they go for a walk and I go for a walk. Mm-hmm. So we're just walking and talking. And the idea of the game I want to basically a narrative of two people who are sitting in the pub together, and they're telling each other a story of a long journey they went on. And and the game is basically, you use stuff you're walking past as prompts to your answers. Like, in other words, like if someone said, what got, there'll be slightly more structure in this, but like, okay, so what happened next on your journey? And then you look to the right and you see a burnt down tree or some, knocked down tree. And it's like, well, I came upon the lands of the Ents, and the great Ent king had fallen. And then, and you build like that. So you basically just use prompts in the real world to sort of describe, tell a story to the other person and vice versa. And of course, that person never knows until like the game's over what inspired stuff. So like, it's sort of an idea of this, just a way to sort of add some entertainment to a walk in a different way, but also kind of like, it's kind of a game about how you can reimagine your environment, because we're all very trapped right now. And the idea of like how you can add, by using fantasy applied to the world you walk through, can sort of free yourself in that way. And there's a few little mechanic things I want to do in terms of questions, but like I just think I should write it up quite quickly and lob it out, because it's kind of like, but it's like, I'm really into game mechanics at the moment. It's kind of very much my hobby.
Do you think that that's something which is influencing how you're writing the Eternals at all as well?
I think so, a bit. Like, the thing is, like, you mentioned not liking rolling. Honestly, I quite like rolling, but I only like rolling when it's meaningful, in terms of like, if a game is about like social interaction, I'm quite into, okay, let's make a roll and it's mechanized in interesting ways, and this will change the fiction in meaningful ways. I said I'm quite into dice as like the Powered by the Apocalypse games and all those sort of things. So, and the interesting about that as a genre is they're all about mechanizing genre, by which I mean, like, you got something like Dungeon World, just basically a poem about D&D. So it's D&D boiled down to its bare essentials. But there is an amazing, oh my god, oh no, I've just forgot its name. Like, there's a telenovela game, Passiones de la Passions, which is basically an RPG about playing in a telenovela. So it's all soap opera, it's all melodrama, it's all big emotions, it's beautifully designed. And it's got moves like, for example, it's like when you accuse someone of lying, or you're lying and this is the truth. And there's various things that feed into the role. Like, you get a bonus if there's an audience, for example. So in other words, your confrontations are more likely to win if you're doing it in front of a big crowd, because that's a genre element. If you've got evidence, there's a plus, but that's minor. But if you roll well, in other words, you get the full success. One of the options you can choose is the accusation is true, even if the audience, as in the game, has defined it false previously. So, for example, you can say, "I know you are lying because you were with my wife last night," and then you roll well. That's true. That fiction has changed, so that person's character is revealed, or even more so, like you are my secret brother, lost when we were children, and then you roll well. Like, no, that's true now, and you know what I mean. That's in that kind of the cascading nature of that sort of soap opera plotting has been absolutely mechanized. So, as a hobby for me as a writer of fiction, a lot of what game design is trying to force me to think of is what decisions are we making in genre fiction? And if I truly understand those decisions and those elements, I can turn them into a mechanic. You know, a mechanic is basically a machine for doing what my brain does. And that's kind of where I am a bit in terms of I'm trying to work out, okay, I can write a story. I've done this a lot. What actually is a story? And that kind of thinking behind everything ties in. Yeah. I mean, so in terms of the game design, part is like, you know, it's not enough for me anymore to just write a story. I've got to be able to teach you how to write a story, and give you the tool that allows you to create this act of magic. Like, basically giving people magic wands. That's how I see game design. As in, like, here's a device, and this will help you see the magic. And like for me, RPGs are very fundamentally like the power of freeing people from the idea that culture is something that has to be given to them. Like, and the idea that, I interviewed Alex, the interview, it's slightly late here now, so my brain's frying, the designer of an amazing game called For the Queen. And she basically argues that thing that RPGs show that human creativity is infinite, and that you can sit down with a table of people and you can make a world between you with a few mechanics and guidelines, and it just emerges, and you've done this wonderful act of magic. As in, the idea that our creativity is infinite is something that I think is fundamentally like an idea that really sort of frees the human spirit in lots of ways, and your agency there and the power there. But yeah, I mean, all that. But I did say thematically is very much in Eternals, and of course, the methodical nature of my thinking in some of this stuff is definitely in Eternals. I mean, I think that kind of comes from Die, and to be honest, Wictive as well. Yeah.
Well, Die is definitely kicking butt and like giving me all the feelings, and like just is a really intense emotional experience for everyone. This is not a surprise at all.
Yes, it really is. It's like I'm writing I'm about to start writing issue 18 next week, and it's obviously issue 20 is probably the last one. So like I'm going.
Oh wait, that's the last issue of the comic. You're saying issue 20?
Yes, it's all of the 20 issue series. That's the plan.
Oh gosh,
it's a 20-sided dice. Well, we're kind of leading into it.
Just to flag, I'm reading it in trade right now, so but please proceed.
I was supposed to say you are up to date, as in 16 hasn't come out yet. The comic comes back in May, so you're safe. I'm not going to I'm not going to, but issue 15 was the big melodramatic, heartbreaking. Melodramatic's the wrong word, but it's the big stage epic. An issue, and the final arc is very much down into the heart of people. And digging into the cast, and it's bleak. I think talk about like COVID influence. So much like, especially Eternals and Die are just bleak books. You get like at least Once the Future has a level of anger that carries you through. Like I think one thing, like where have you read up to Once the Future?
Whatever is the most recent on Comixology.
Right. In which case, the end of the second arc made it clear that the political element is coming back in quite strongly. And that continues, and it gets. I mean, the issue that's just going to press is probably the most political it's got, and it's very much me in like 2000 AD pop anger mode, I guess. At least that's the energy, but the kind of the dourness of Die is kind of that's about close to how I really feel right now. That's depressing.
But also anger is like a way that a lot of us choose to process grief too.
True.
Particularly, I think, as activists. I have a question from Steve Atwell that this is a good segue into, which was with Once and Future, do you think that there's links between the stories that the foundational mythology of particular countries and the political and national ideologies that they hold, like taking from those?
I think that's such a big question and we're not wish to generalize. You know what I mean?
Fair enough.
Like,
yeah,
especially because the idea of continuity and actually, partially because I wouldn't want to generalize, partially because I just don't know. I don't know. I mean, one of the things, I've got several really big books on the history of nationalism that I want to, like literally one about the size of my torso. And it's one of those areas I wanted to research and I have not get around to doing it properly. Like,
no worries.
But no, it's like, ask me next year and I may have a better answer. It's interesting, especially because the idea of, I mean, nationalism was a word that was invented in the 19th century. You know, the idea of, the idea of countries as we know it did not exist. And the idea, if we think of countries the way we do think of countries in historically speaking, that's an error. You know, it's a bit like there's all sorts of ideas which we just accept, like, like class is a good example. Anytime I argue with like a classical, talk to a classical historian, because I'm always putting a class struggle reading.
Yes.
And then, they're much more interested in how they self-identified. And that's not exactly, and the evidence for that just isn't there. So in terms of like modern national identity built, because if you look at fascism is about, one of the things fascism does is patch together a completely fictitious past. So
yeah,
those myths, no matter what those myths said, the fascists will turn them into something else. And this is the reason why I always had trouble defining myself as a fantasy writer, despite clearly being a fantasy writer, was that, fantasy is a genre which tends to say the past was better than the future, or the past is definitely better than the present. And it's about the idea of, it's a small C conservative genre. And it doesn't have to be. Obviously, there's we can all list off enormous creators who have kicked against that.
Yeah.
But it really, in some level, that's the default. And that, in the same way that romanticism blends into fascism quite well, fantasy blends into that kind of ideas too. And that troubles me, and which is why I like interrogating him.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, even fantasy authors who are very much self-identified as like radicals still struggle with this cropping up in ways in their work. So I hear that. Well,
I feel like I just dodged the question completely.
No, it's great. This is perfect engagement. It's funny. I feel like I don't know if we on this podcast have ever talked to you specifically about music that's happening now, but like, what is a COVID era pick that you've had musically that you would think folks should check out? It doesn't have to be contemporary, but it certainly can be.
Right. So it's like my listening this year, actually, I think it's 179, my newsletter. I actually did my tracks of the year last year. That was my tracks of the year post. And last year has not been a major year for new music. Like, I've listened to a lot of stuff, but in terms of like really keeping up, I haven't been. And therefore, this year's also been a year when I've dug into, I mentioned the Led Zeppelin. I haven't gone to Led Zeppelin, but I've been digging into stuff like, why on earth did I never listen properly to Black Sabbath? I'm a Midlander. Like, why on earth?
Yeah.
And they are literally the most Midlands band of all time. And I was a metalhead. I was a metalhead before I was an indie kid. Why did I never really explore Black Sabbath? And one of the podcasts I listened to had a very big long section and talking about like all the Aussie stuff. And I just sat and listened to all that. And it was, it was good. It was just really interesting. And, getting into a band with that length of stuff was really an interesting period. My track of the year, I was really into Of Montreal's Fun album. You Are Fun, it was called, which is just really nice to hear them having a nice time. Especially because, for those of us who've liked Of Montreal, go back to, I forgot the name, Hissing Fauna, You Are the Destroyer. They're kind of like, their bleak, utterly breakdown mess of an album. And to hear them being in a much better place was something that really I got strength from. Because like, all of us who have been in truly dark places, the idea that someone could be feeling better is nice.
Yeah.
The flip is like, I was really into like, the weird thing is the music gets stopped. Like Poppy's, I Disagree was a record I obsessed over, like just before COVID. And it was just really nihilistic and gleeful and playful with it. And just like stuff that was gleeful and playful and nihilistic was a lot harder to listen to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's been interesting.
I'm so excited about you getting into Black Sabbath because they're one of the greatest bands ever, and there's so much politics that's happening in it. I just have to share a story. I was in the position where a colleague of mine who moved to the U.S. in recent years, and so grew up with a very different music history than us. We were at this club, and this band starts covering Black Sabbath, and I like lose my mind about how excited I am. And she's like, "Oh, I don't know about this." So I told her the story of how Tony Iommi experiencing an industrial accident is why we have the drop D tuning and why metal became a thing. And she looks at me and says, "That's so beautiful. The music of working people will always find a way to be expressed."
Awesome.
And it was just like, yeah, there's heavy metal is intrinsically coming from industrial worker experience, and like class is just built into it. And we wouldn't have the drop D tuning without that.
That is fascinating.
Anywho, well, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. I always end the show asking people, where can our listeners find your folks online? So I'll say that here as well.
My name, Kieran Gillen. The best place, I'm on Twitter, but I'm not actually on Twitter as much anymore. The best way to generally stay up to date with me is my mailing list, which is on Substack, kierangillen.substack.com. And I mail like every week or two, and it's about what work I've got coming out, but it's also about random thoughts from my head downloaded at length being the key phrase there. And it's been, hopefully there's at least 3 good jokes.
I really enjoy it. So I definitely suggest folks get on the Substack. And you do tweet enough to be worth following on Twitter. So,
Thank you.
Folks, you're on no obligation to tweet as much as I do, which, by the way, is at ELANA_Brooklyn. That's ELANA_Brooklyn. But you're on Twitter enough to be worth following, certainly, and I do enjoy your account there. But yeah, the newsletter is awesome. And so to our listeners, Graphic Policy Radio continues to march forward on our podcast. As you may have noticed, I've also been releasing episodes of my new Deep Space Nine podcast called Deep Space Dive, which we will be shifting to have on its own RSS feed so that the comics people and the Trek people don't have to listen to both of them if they don't want to. But I certainly invite you to if you're interested in Deep Space Nine, the most political of all the Star Treks, and graphicpolicy.com for all your comics news and reviews. As we like to say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.